All right, everybody, we are continuing our march through the book of Revelation and seeing it through a different perspective to help us find a more Jesus-looking picture of final judgment and this whole big concept that we have about hell. And just for a little marker, this is episode 46 on our mini-series on what the hell. Part 9 of that series, and specifically, this is our third episode on the book of Revelation, which is going to carry us to the end of our series here. Now, so far in Revelation, we've covered the first 5 chapters of the book, which is served as really just a prelude to what John is intending to reveal as we get into the meat of his content, which is really between chapter 6 and 22. And we've already seen some, pretty compelling, non-violent, Jesus-looking references and imagery in these first 5 chapters. And this grand overview of Revelation that we're doing is, it's all going to be leading up to how the book actually reveals Jesus acting in non-violence when he returns, rather than what we have been so traditionally taught as Jesus forcefully carrying out violence and putting people in hell to suffer eternal conscious torment in a literal fiery flames. Yeah, Jesus' destruction and eradication of evil and sin at his return is going to be final, and it's going to be complete. That's what the book of Revelation is trying to show us here. But I'm challenging this teaching that evildoers are going to suffer eternal torture and flames, which I don't believe the book actually teaches when you dig in beyond just a surface level reading of it. So that's what we're doing here now. So to be sure to check out those previous episodes of Revelation to get caught up. All right, so last time our discussion centered around the first 4 seals that the slaughtered lamb opens on the scroll at the beginning of chapter 6. And those seals revealed, that's what their intention is for, to reveal things, revealed 4 men riding on horses, which many of us know as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And as most of us probably know, it's traditionally taught that these 4 horsemen are represented. If you're looking at my hands, I spilled printer ink all over my fingers, which is great to have that on there. But as most of us know, these 4 horsemen, it's usually taught that, they're representations of utter chaos and destruction and violence that God is going to unleash on the earth when his final judgment begins. That it's God who is empowering and unleashing these agents of evil to get payback, to get retribution, and to act violently on those who continue to resist him, and to give them what they are due. With some even claiming that the first rider of the white horse, that's actually Jesus himself. But what I did in that last episode was to provide what I believe to be the more Jesus-honoring perspective for how you look at these 4 seals and those 4 horsemen, which is far more in line with the overall story of cosmic and satanic warfare that is really the main story that's found in the heart of the book of Revelation that we looked at in chapters 12 and 13. So let me just explain that. That sounds like what they say, a word soup, a bunch of words all thrown together. Doesn't make a lot of sense. So chapters 12 and 13 of Revelation show that it's Satan, that he also has authority, and he also has power, and also has crowns of kingship that are shown to be on this dragon, and that Satan is the one who empowers agents of evil to work evil on the earth in opposition to God's kingdom. And Revelation is revealing that he's been doing this the whole time. And then we saw that the beast in chapter 13 that comes out of the sea, he is empowered. But Satan, the dragon, has empowered him to conquer, and with violence, which is the exact same task that the white rider in chapter 6 was given to do. We notice just how as Satan and the beast wear crowns, the rider of the white horse also has a crown, right? So, and after reminding ourselves how both Jesus' ministry and other passages of the New Testament reveal that there really are two warring kingdoms in heaven and earth, and how chapters 12 and 13 revealed the exact same truth, it became all too obvious that chapter 6 and these 4 seals are actually revealing Satan's evil activity and work, and are not revealing God's activity that's going to come in the future. That's what those first 4 seals revealed when the slaughtered lamb opened them. Jesus wasn't future telling about what God was going to be doing vindictively in judgment, but the slaughtered lamb was revealing the hidden work of all of Satan's demonic kingdom of darkness that had already been operating this way, and how it continues to operate this way, and it's going to be operating this way in ever-increasing intensity as we now grow closer and closer to Jesus' second coming. That's what chapter 6 and those first 4 seals revealed. The operations of the enemy kingdom now fully revealed and open for the whole world to know and see. And I know that's a huge paradigm shift for many of us who grew up with a different interpretation of these horsemen. You know, many of us were told that all the events that take place between chapter 6 and the end of the book of Revelation, you know, they're all going to be future, worldwide events that are going to happen on a strict calendar and a timeline. And, you know, the folks who taught us this were sincere. You know, many of them we look up to, and for me, I was given a steady diet of that view when I was in my early childhood and my teenage years. But, you know, taking that view of Revelation also led to a lot of disappointment in faith communities like those, because the dates and the timelines that were proposed failed to come to pass time and again, and they've been doing that for hundreds of years, because there's a history over the church the last couple hundred years where there's been a school of thought or communities of faith that have believed that, and they continue to fail. You know, their timetables and their predictions of these end time global events of evil, just they come to naught. They come to nothing. Which is why I want to remind us of something that John said in chapter 1, verse 19. When John was told to, quote, "Write therefore what you have seen, what is now, and what will take place later." You see, John wasn't only writing about future events. We know he's writing about a future event, about the eventual second coming of Jesus. And he's going to be writing about that, of course, right? As things progress towards that end. And when Jesus comes and the New Jerusalem descends down from heaven, and peace and goodwill towards men finally reigns on earth, and there's going to be no more bloodshed, and no more violence, and no more sickness, and no more disease, no more death, and, you know, hallelujah, amen, praise God. But as I read from that verse, John is also writing here in Revelation about what is now, and he's writing about a totality of history. What is now? So he's writing both just revealing what's happening in this age as well as what's to come. And all that to say, I believe John is making it pretty darn clear that these 4 horsemen are representing what Satan has been doing for ages past, the reality of what his kingdom is doing now, and what that kingdom is going to be doing with even greater intensity in the future as we continue to inch closer and closer to Jesus' return. Now, seeing those 4 as revealing seals, those first 4 seals as something that reveals rather than that's predicting, you know, and looking at these 4 horsemen of the apocalypse that come forth in a way that does not accredit violence to God, man, that's just so much more in line with the self-sacrificial, non-violent, slaughtered lamb that we find all throughout the New Testament and in these, the pages in Revelation that came before we even got to chapter 6. And now that we've got that foundation established, we're on track to continue with this book of Revelation from that viewpoint. That's what we're doing here. So let's continue reading past where this fourth seal was opened in chapter 6 and see what other revelations, what other revealings, what other uncoverings John has for us as we finish out the last three of the remaining 7 seals and get deeper in this book here. So after Jesus, as I keep referring to, that's our context, that's our image of him, the lamb who was slaughtered by violence, who didn't respond in violence, after he finishes opening these first 4 seals and revealing some of the devil's horrible evil works, as we saw in the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, the lamb now opens the 5th seal. The 5th seal is open and reveals a picture of heaven and all the souls of past Christians who have also been killed by remaining faithful to God and responding in nonviolence, just like Jesus was. And they cry out, asking, God, when are you going to respond and give us justice to those people on earth who have murdered us and continued to murder your people? And all these martyrs are given white robes to wear, which is a symbol that they have been faithful to God and maintain their righteousness through their nonviolent response to persecution. But what is truly sad is I don't think they get the answer they're hoping for, because the reply they get tells them that it's going to be a while, because there are more souls to come who are going to be slaughtered, just like Jesus. Yikes. I mean, that is the gospel message, or I should say, if that was the gospel message that was preached today, especially where I'm from in America here, I bet there'd be a lot less Christians who would be boldly proclaiming their faith. And I might be one of them. That's just not what we get. We get more of a, God is here to be our friend. God is here to bless our lives and give us prosperity and wealth, or, give you a good marriage. And not that I disagree with that stuff, but there's a whole other part that we don't really get, which was how to respond to evil and things that are going on in this world when they come from the hands of other humans. Whew. I mean, being nonviolent and dying for your faith, that was serious stuff for these early Christians back then. And this 5th seal, if you think about that, it's further proof that these 4 horsemen that were revealed earlier, that they're not from God, because these slaughtered saints who are underneath the altar in God's heavenly throne room, they're the same ones crying out, asking for justice in response to the slaughtering that we just saw going on with the 4 horsemen. I mean, did you see that? Death in Hades is following the 4 horsemen, and the saints in heaven are crying out for God to avenge them for all the death and crap and the havoc these 4 horsemen have done to the earth. One other side note here. Some folks have asserted that these 4 horsemen are indeed God's judgment. But specifically, they try and tie, God doing this evil work by going back to listing the blessing and curses from Deuteronomy chapter 28. I think that's the right chapter. But their thinking is that, my printer's a little cut off there. Their thinking with this is that that God made promises to Israel to bless them if they kept the covenant, the old Mosaic covenant that was done at Mount Sinai. But at the same time in that chapter, it says that there's a promise he's going to curse them violently if they didn't keep the covenant. And well, since everyone has broken the covenant because everyone is a sinner, this divine retribution that happens with the 4 horsemen is just God honoring, his promises, what he said. That his judgment is, it's coming on covenant breakers. Now, if you hold to that thinking, isn't it ironic that the very people who are crying out to God because they have been slaughtered through violence by persecution in this 5th seal are the very people that have been keeping God's covenant? It's not the covenant breakers who are crying for relief from God's punishment and justice. It's the very people who are in this new covenant, these covenant keepers, that are being murdered. So I don't think that line of thinking holds any water. And what we're actually seeing here in this fifth seal is actually a lot closer to the book of Job, where in that book, the ultimate question being addressed is, why do bad things happen to good people? Why are bad things befalling those who stand in righteousness with God, just like Job was righteous? And thank God that John is revealing in this fifth seal here, and very clearly to us that, listen, all of the evil work that is going on, it all comes back to Satan, and is all under his authority and his empowerment. Now for that sixth seal, I'm going to read that passage for us. This starts in verse 12. When the Lamb opened the sixth seal, I looked, and behold, there was a great earthquake. And the sun became black as sackcloth, and the full moon became like blood. And the stars of the sky fell to the earth, as the fig tree sheds its winter fruit when it's shaken by a gale by wind. And the sky vanished like a scroll being rolled up. And every mountain and island was removed from its place. Every mountain and island removed. Now the sixth seal is a total side note to our main point of hell and nonviolence, but man, it's so obvious. What John is describing here is figurative language. It's not literal. It's not talking about literal events that are happening, which is pretty much almost like all the language in Revelation. And I encourage you to be very weary to take literal the things that John describes in this book. There's more going on underneath the surface level, because describing literal things verbatim is not his purpose here. Here's the weird part, guys, with that. Many folks who take the lake of fire, that comes in chapter 20, as literal, would actually agree with what I just said here about chapter 6 and the seal here about John's language being figurative, about the sun being darkened and the moon turning to blood. It's hard to imagine the stars falling to the earth, literally, since we know in real life one star is, thousands of times larger than the earth. It'd be impossible. It's not physically possible for multiple stars to fall onto the earth, and if that happened, we'd all be dead. The entire sky just vanishing like a scroll. What's going to be there instead? And being rolled up. It's kind of fun to try and imagine that literal. And then if you're going to continue to take everything in chapter 6 literal, then you have to argue that every single mountain and every little island is just going to, be no more. And that they're lifted and removed from their places. Dudes, we got lots of people that live on islands, lots of missionaries, and people who are in Christ following him to the best of their ability. What's going to happen to them if you're taking this passage literally? John was writing from the island of Patmos, so that's interesting to consider. So no, I don't think John's vision here of the sixth seal being opened, or really any of these seals being opened, were intended to be taken as literal historical events that are going to unfold like on a timeline, one after another, that you could predict and point out. Rather, I believe Revelation is like this big cloud, or as one of my mentors says, it's like a Picasso-like painting. It's not clear. And it's all wrapped in together. But in this kind of a picture, you see God is unveiling to John in vivid imagery all the works of Satan that are infecting the earth. And secondly, he's providing the early church with the understanding of Satan's works, and giving that understanding, and giving them the hope that they needed to get through their persecutions, by giving them encouragement that God's decisive judgment and final victory over Satan and every evil work is eventually going to come. Even if it came at the cost of their lives, it's going to come. So that's the encouragement, to remain faithful even though this junk is about to happen. And it's kind of that big cloud of junk, not a calendar, a timeline, or so forth. But I'm asking here, hey, if you're going to take the lake of fire as being a literal lake of burning eternal fire, then how can you exclude yourself from taking these other grandiose pictures in Revelation literal as well? You know, like the stuff I just mentioned in chapter 6. I think that's a valid question. Folks are so eager to promote a real, literal, flaming lake of fire that when they come across passages like this with the sixth seal, you know, some of those same people are the first ones to say, well, oh no, that stuff in, you know, the sixth seal, that's not literal. Well, I don't know, guys. I think that strict literal approach doesn't hold much water. And of course, I'm foreshadowing eventually what we're going to talk about in chapter 20 there, but I'm digressing. Let's move on. All right, the last 3 verses from this chapter, it's still revelation that's coming from the sixth seal. There's just a lot more content with the sixth seal. And I want to read them here for us because they name a group of people who are going to be very important people for us to be familiar with when we come and get into the later chapters of the book. So this is a little information you got to kind of put in your pocket till we get to a couple more episodes on the road. But it says in verse 15, then the kings of the earth, there's the people, that's the phrase, the kings of the earth, and the great ones, and the generals, and the rich, and the powerful, and everyone, slave and free, they hid themselves in caves among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us, and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand? That's the first time in Revelation where you hear that phrase, the kings of the earth. And when we think of the kings of earth, you know, we might imagine that today as, you know, all the government officials and who hold power and those who rule and wealthy business folks and leaders. And these kings of the earth are mentioned there a few more times in Revelation, and they become absolutely central in Revelation's later chapters, where we're going to be starting to talk about hell more specifically. I think we'll start to do that really around chapter 14. Now, why is this? It's because the kings of the earth, they later find themselves smack dab in the middle of God's coming final judgment, where it can appear that they meet their final doom and are wiped out. But, contrary to what many have been led to believe, there's a surprise ending that comes later with the kings of the earth. That's really going to throw you for a loop, especially if you take a more traditional view of hell. We'll see that when we get into chapters 21 and 22. And all that's going to come later on. So put that kings of the earth thing in your pocket, and we see them right here trembling. And look at what they're trembling about. They're calling on fear of what they call the wrath. The wrath of what? The wrath of the Lamb. Now that's an obvious juxtaposition of two completely opposite ideas together, right? Wrath, which you normally think of as mighty power and violence and bloodshed. Bloodshed where, you know, you're just forcefully doing something upon another. But then you've got this Lamb, which we normally think as, you know, one of the most unmighty, non-violent, peaceful, and gentle things imaginable. Although I did suggest that a Florida manatee would be even more of a peaceful image, but John didn't seem to go that route, so anyways. And to raise the ante on how opposite of a juxtaposition this is, remember, we're not just talking about a little lamb that's jumping around doing binkies and zoomies in a flowery meadow. We're talking about a slaughtered lamb with blood all over it, right? That image, that's why I keep referring to Jesus as a slaughtered lamb. That's the weakest figure imaginable when you compare it to power and brute force. So it's clearly two different things going on and merging them together, being conflated. And I want to say two things about this juxtaposition before we move on to chapter 7. And I need to do this because it's the first time that we see that word wrath used in the book of Revelation. And it'll come up, I think, a few times more as we go on through the book. So it's a good time to unpack that and review that now. Now I know we're going slow through these this Revelation expose that we're doing here, but we will pick up speed as we move along here. We just got a lot of groundwork to lay, so hang with me. All right, number one, we've already spent over a half an episode talking about what God's wrath looks like in light of how Jesus revealed the character and nature of God, and really specifically did that on the cross. You can find my little, it was almost like a half an episode on episode 34 where we talked about this. We went over Romans chapter 5, verses 6 through 9, where wrath is also mentioned. And we compared that against Romans 1. And in addition to that episode, we also did 4 episodes on the problem of evil and violence, including one that dealt with the understanding, how do you understand all the accreditation and portrayals of God being violent in the Old Testament. So we've done a lot of work on this. But since John is bringing up wrath for the first time in Revelation chapter 6 here, we have to keep in mind that it is the non-violent, slaughtered lamb that is being envisioned when he says the wrath of the Lamb. We've already covered that from past chapters of Revelation. And that's what we learned about the wrath of God when taken through a Jesus-centered lens and understanding. That Jesus hit the reset button on our understanding of God and taught us that rather than responding to evil with more evil and bloodshed, that's how humans would do it, makes sense to us. Jesus, especially even when it seems like the right thing to do, Jesus instead showed us that God's wrath is to let go. That's what we saw in Romans chapter 1. Rather than using sovereign power to just wipe out and destroy one's enemies, as God could do theoretically, he's almighty, he could just squash you with just a thought. He's the all-powerful creator of the universe. Instead, God's reaction towards evil is to give people up to their own ways and let the consequences fall organically as they will. So that's the first point I want to remind us about when you're seeing that word wrath in the Revelation here. And you have to keep that in mind when you read this, and keep that understanding through a Jesus lens and looking at the cross. Now the second point, with this whole idea of the kings of the earth and the great ones and the generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone, and they're afraid of the slaughtered lamb and the slaughtered lamb's wrath, right? They're all afraid of the wrath of the lamb. That is another deception of Satan. Follow with me on this. We already saw how Jesus responds to evildoers when he died for them on the cross. God's not violent. He doesn't punish people with violence. Rather, he exposes deception to bring truth. And when that fails, the only thing left to do is to let us go and to let our own violent behavior ricochet back upon ourselves, which that process, that's what undoes evil from within and causes it to implode upon itself and eradicating it. In fact, we're going to see more and more of that response to evil happening as we continue throughout the book. That's what we're actually going to see as we get closer to Jesus' return, is a letting go. Yet, just as the ancient serpent did with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, from that story from Genesis 3, the serpent continues in the same slanderous activity now, having pulled the wool over her eyes, preventing us to be able to see God as being a good God who comes to heal and restore, that God has our best interest in mind, that God is gentle as a lamb. Notice how the Apostle Paul puts this in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 by saying, and if our gospel is veiled, right, it is veiled to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this world, the ancient serpent, has blinded the minds of the eyes of unbelievers. And let me interject here in this verse. And what is Satan blinding them to? Well, Paul goes on and says right here, to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. Whew. That's what they're being blinded to, the image of God, who God really is, his picture, his nature, his character. And what was that? Jesus, who is the image of God. That's what they're being blinded to. Because he doesn't look like the God you'd expect. We keep thinking he's a violent, angry, vindictive, retributive God. And Satan is blinding the eyes of unbelievers to that truth. Verse 8, for what we proclaim is not ourselves, but we're proclaiming that Christ is Lord, for with ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, let light shine out in the darkness, has shown in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Remember, those kings of the earth are afraid. They want to hide themselves from the face of God that's coming. You see, guys, the God of this world has blinded the kings of the earth's eyes. They are still incorrectly seeing the slaughtered lamb, wanting to get payback and retribution and to be violent towards them, rather than being enlightened to the deep love God has for them and seeing God as a life giver who wants and is giving them the opportunity to be freed from their sinful condition. And that nasty dragon, the ancient serpent, has got them convinced that God's out to get them violently. And so that they got to hide away in the mountains and the rocks away from God and get away from him. I mean, that's the same type of idea. It's the same deception that was happening in the Garden of Eden, that somehow God isn't out for your good intentions, that he's not in favor of you. That was the enemy's lie in the Garden of Eden. And so he's trying to hide things from you, and he's trying to, not make your life as good, and you'd be just like him if you could eat of this tree and stuff. So it's a deception. And that's what sin always does. It makes us run and hide. We've covered that in other episodes. That's exactly when Jesus meets Peter, or Simon at that time, in the boat and fills Simon's boat to bursting with all the fish. Peter's response was, get away from me. I'm a sinful man. Oh, you just want to hide, you want to get away. And this is also the devil's MO. It's his signature. He's always making false statements and lies and slandering God and slandering God's goodness. And that always brings sin. A while back, someone in a class that I was presenting on or in asked a really good question to me, saying, hey man, if God's judgment is self-sacrifice and self-giving, and doing that to display this refining and restoring love that God has, if that's his judgment, then why doesn't the New Testament just ditch all this violent language like wrath, or the wrath of God, or the wrath of the Lamb? Why didn't John just move away from all that language, knowing that it conjures up, naturally violent imageries in our minds when you use words like that? I mean, if Jesus is nonviolent, why still use wrath? That's one of the best questions I was ever asked. Now, I don't have time to address that in long form, but I will say just shortly that God entered into solidarity with Israel when the ancient scriptures were written. The Spirit of God was present and breathed those scriptures into being. They're holy and they're sacred, but you see, God also had to breathe them through the prophet's own fallen and broken cultural understandings about God and about a number of things. That's why you see a lot of junk in the Old Testament, like slavery and polygamy and so on. And also the idea that of vengeance and payback and retribution and wrath being enacted through violence. These were fallen ideas and cultural contexts that they had. Those are things that don't reflect God as revealed in Jesus on the cross. However, that was inherent in their thinking with those who God had to work with, you know. And yes, there's many places in the Old Testament where it says, you know, on a surface level, that the Messiah is going to come back with violence. But guys, there's equally many places in the Old Testament where this wrath is represented as non-violence and even restorative, such as ruling the nations with a sword or rod that comes out of the Messiah's mouth, as we read in Isaiah chapter 11. Therefore, when Jesus comes on the scene in the Gospels, he enters into that fallen narrative and takes upon him, he takes, you know, that broken language upon him and confirms that he was working through his people. But now, here's what he gets to do. He gets to reinterpret what God's wrath actually means and looks like. He jumps in that language, uses it, affirms it, but reinterprets what it actually is and how it's the methodology for it working out. Yeah, God is going to get vengeance and wrath, and that evil doers are going to stand accountable for their actions. They're going to be met with the face of God. But he doesn't get it via the mechanisms that humans usually imagine, which is violence, bloodshed, or torture. Rather, after doing everything possible to avoid, you know, terrible consequences in advance, after extending every opportunity and exhausting every other resource, in God's wrath and anger, he lets them go and gives evil over to its own devices. And we're not talking about just human, we're talking about cosmic evil, satanic evil, demonically empowered evil. Yeah, evil doers and evil, it does come to an end. But they come to their end at their own hand, with their own violence returning upon them through their own swords. We're going to see that as we move through the book of Revelation, as we dive deeper into some of these texts and look beyond the surface level. So yeah, it's wrath, all right, but it's not the type of wrath humans imagine. It's just how, like we use that phrase, hey, kill him with kindness, which is kind of a dumb phrase, but we still use it. Yes, you slaughter and destroy and figuratively kill people as you respond to their negative actions and words with kindness. And therefore, it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek way to say you killed them, right? Because the love you shared with them disarmed them, and their evil actions and intentions were completely annihilated and neutralized. That's the wrath of God towards evil doers. Now, it's about the quickest overview on the wrath of the Lamb we see here in chapter 6 that I can give without just going into another 10 episodes on that one topic. So check out those other episodes that I mentioned. And because we have this language in Revelation now of wrath and so forth, we always have to keep in mind that this is the wrath of the slaughtered, non-violent Lamb that John had been seeing, who was crucified on the cross. So we established that in chapter 1 of Revelation. A wrath that does not use the power, or doesn't use power, and wrath doesn't use any type of force to murder and get his ways. But one who, as the Apostle Paul says, the Lamb is the image of God, displayed love and weakness to transform the hearts and the minds of its enemies, even to his own hurt. Guys, always keep that in mind. The kings of the earth and others might have their hearts blinded to this truth and continue to resist God because the enemy is, the God of this world is blinding their eyes. But for us who have turned towards the light of the gospel, the veil has been removed. And now we see God for who he really is, the image of God, Jesus Christ. And that's the end of chapter 6, guys. We started with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and then we went on to the 5th seal, where the slaughtered lamb and martyrs are calling out to God, where the slaughtered martyrs, were calling out to God in justice. And then the 6th seal, where we saw all those apocalyptic and grandiose terms used to describe what took place in heaven when all this was revealed. and how the kings of the earth and the rest of the people were terrified when they believed, and imagined that this soon coming violent encounter with the wrath of the Lamb and seeing the Lord face to face, what that was all going to entail. So that's what we've done so far. Now we're on to chapter 7. And chapter 7 actually is describing additional events and activity that was still taking place after John opens up the 6th seal. Okay, so it's just continuing more information that's coming after this 6th seal was opened. So the first 3 verses of John chapter 7 read this. After this I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth, to prevent any wind from blowing on the land or on the sea or on any tree. Then I saw another angel coming up from the east, having the seal of the living God, and he called out in a loud voice to these 4 angels who had been given power. They were given power to harm the land and the sea. Do not harm the land and the sea or the trees until we put a seal on the foreheads of the servants of our God. Right, the first thing I want to point out here is that wind, right? Just like water was commonly associated with evil activity. That's how the Old Testament and even the New Testament personifies wind. Well, there's good wind, right? Like the Spirit of God. And that word spirit is actually the same word that gets translated as wind. And that's in the Old Testament, the Hebrew word is ruach. In the New Testament, it's pneuma. That's the Greek word for it. So that's good. You want the Holy Spirit. You want the good wind, right? But then there are evil winds. Like the wind that hit the 4 corners, actually it says that, the 4 corners of Job's house and destroyed it and all of its occupants. And we know that evil wind came from Satan, and because Satan was hell-bent on trying to destroy Job's life to see if he would curse God if everything was taken away from him. Job was only in relation with God because God was really good to him. Or Daniel chapter 7. Daniel prophetically speaks about the 4 winds of heaven. Okay, the 4 winds of heaven that stir up the raging sea where nasty beasts emerge who are opposed to God. And he even credits that they're coming from heaven, right? These are evil winds. It's because Satan is the prince of the power of the air. It also comes from a cosmic authority. You could say a heavenly type of endowment of power, a heavenly authority. Just because he's not the only God is not the only actor in heaven. So yeah, it's the power from heaven, which is a reference to Satan, because God's not the only power in heaven, right? That's where it comes from. And in this chapter 7 of Daniel, it says that Daniel says that the Ancient of Days, which is a reference to the Messiah, who now we know has been slaughtered, the violent, non-violent Lamb of Jesus. It's him who comes and annihilates these sea beasts that the wind from heaven stirs up. And puts all the blasphemy that they are speaking against God to rest and takes their power and authority away. Whew. Lots of evil winds going on. And of course, in Mark chapter 4, when Jesus tried to get to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, eventually he was going to minister to the demoniac over there, or maybe there's 2 demoniacs, depending on how you read different parallel passages in Luke and Matthew and Mark. It says that a great windstorm, right? Windstorm rose up and kicked up the waves. Boy, it sounds just like Daniel. To where the boats were almost sinking. And Jesus speaks to the wind for it to be calm. And when he does, the wind subsides, with his disciples being astounded, saying, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Now we got to get back to what we read in chapter 7 here, Revelation. So yeah, when chapter 7 here of Revelation says that there's 4 angels who are holding back the 4 winds of the earth, this is a reference to spiritual warfare. Okay? We're in the heavenlies. And heaven doesn't necessarily just mean God. It means in the spiritual cosmic realm. That's what heaven means. The angelic forces of good are fighting demonic forces and holding back, saying, no, don't do this. We're going to mark these people. We're going to fight against these people so we can do this action first. Now, remember, as I tried to use my voice to bring it out when I read that passage, it does say that the four winds and these four angels, sometimes that's a synonymous thing, had been given power and authority. Right? They had been given authority. But as we learned from the last episode, the serpent also gives authority and power. He doles it out. We read that in Revelation chapter 13 as he doled it out to the beast. So don't go thinking that God is the one who gave this authority to the four winds to destroy the earth. When we see Jesus rebuking and pushing back the same wind and waves when they try to destroy him. Oh, that's terrible theology, guys, because no, God and Satan do not work in cahoots. This is spiritual warfare, guys. Even though it might be tough to see that so clearly here with the language when that word releasing. When you read that word releasing on a surface level, but don't be fooled. Don't take the bait. Okay? The next thing I want to mention only briefly here is the sealing process that the angel mentions in verse 3 and then goes on to talk about here. And of course, if you've read the rest of this chapter, the sealing process goes on to mention 12,000 folks from all the 12 tribes of Israel. That they're all sealed, and that gives you 144,000. Lucky for me, you know, what that whole 144,000 represents, and, you know, all the numerology that people have done over that, you know, that's beyond the scope of what we're doing in this podcast, because our main focus is on hell and portraying God as being nonviolent. So, I don't have to deal with that here. But what I am going to say is that we find this sealing activity mirrored in chapter 13. We just haven't read through chapter 13 yet, but that's where the evil cosmic beast, who is empowered and given authority by Satan, does the same thing. It's just fascinating. And you'd never know that unless you had read that middle of the book, chapters 12 and 13, and read that in light of, you know, first, before you read chapter 7. Check this out. It says the presumably good angel here in chapter 7 puts a mark on the people's forehead, the faithful. He puts a mark on the faithful. And then the beast in chapter 13 puts its mark either on the hand or on the forehead. That's, you know, if you've ever heard the mark of the beast in Revelation chapter 13, that's where it's coming from here, you know. And I can tell you firsthand that there's been plenty of speculation in the past couple hundred years as to what this mark of the beast is going to be. And it really hasn't changed that much over, you know, 1,000 years or whatever, because technology hasn't really been that different. You know, it used to be that it's going to be like a physical branding, like when you brand cattle with a hot iron, or maybe a tattoo. That's kind of been the impression for a long time. But of course now with technology, it's developed into other things. When I was in college in the early 2000s and late 1990s, we were told it might be like an embedded barcode that's put in you, or electronic tagging or tracking. And now, in the 2020s here, it's some type of maybe AI technological advice that people that you might be using that's tied to the economic systems of this world. And interestingly enough, you know, there's much that comes later in the book of Revelation regarding world economics and how the dragon and his beast interfere with those realms. So, you know, that's interesting. Some good speculation there. But wouldn't you know it, once again, the scope of these episodes are limited to our views of hell. So, whew, I don't have to weigh in on this stuff either. So, yay for me. But what I want to bring out in mentioning this sealing of the 144,000 in chapter 7 is that once again, we see the signature. the MO of that ancient dragon, which is imposturing and copycatting. Right? Just like we saw him posturing with the white horse with the crown and the four horsemen that had a bow. And we see Satan continuing to be an imposter in the later pages of Revelation as well. We're going to see that's continuing, so I'm just bringing up that now to show you the recurring theme. You know, God's mark is sealing. That mark or sealing, it comes by faith and reliance and relationship with God. It's modeled in self-sacrificial love when you do that to your own hurt. Modeled after Jesus-looking systems and structures that are antithetical to greed and abuse and injustices. That's what a Jesus-looking economic structure would be. The mark of the beast gives the appearance of economic security, but its systems are corrupt and based upon the kingdom of darkness and void of relationship with God. You know, they've got the appearance of goodness, but their true nature will be revealed as evil. It's like they are clouds without rain, as Jude puts it. I love that. He says, oh, cloud, oh, good news. It doesn't have any rain in it. Nuts. And as the book of Revelation progresses, we'll see that Satan's false kingdoms, his false systems that he's created on the world and in the world, they're going to end up in total collapse and failure as God pronounces and sends judgment against them through his letting go. And as he does that, it causes the demonic systems to implode upon themselves. I don't want to give away the ending to the book, but there it is. All this goes to show you that we have to be very careful when we're looking at the book of Revelation to make sure we're seeing God for who he is, which is the slain, sacrificial, non-violent lamb, the image of God that Apostle Paul talked about in 2 Corinthians 2. And not get that confused with the activity of Satan, which ways are always evil. They're always violent. They're chaos and bloodshed, which I know it can be very easy to do if you're reading Revelation at only a surface level understanding. So hopefully these episodes are helping you see this book in a different light. All right, after these 144,000 are marked, John then sees a multitude of people from all nations and tribes and languages, and they're in front of the throne and before the slain lamb, and they erupt in worship and adoration towards God with all the creatures of heaven and the elders and all, they're all following suit, just mass praise and worship. Within this scene, the last two verses end with a foreshadowing of the last two chapters of the book, where it says that those who remain faithful to the Lamb, they're going to hunger no more. That's what the last two chapters of the book say. They're going to thirst no more. They're not going to suffer affliction, or the sun, or the scorching heat. And they're going to, God's going to wipe away every tear from their eyes. It's a great foreshadowing. What a beautiful thing. And no wonder why I'd be erupting in praise. You're seeing that, imagining that. It's a beautiful taste of what's to come for those who remain faithful in the midst of all the evil that the kingdom of darkness is bringing to the earth. That is soon going to even be intensified. That's how chapter 7 closes. And for these, these last few minutes, we've just been talking about the additional revelations that John received when that sixth seal was opened. It carried over into chapter 7. That sixth seal had a lot of content that went with it. And remember that all the hoopla that I just talked about that happened when the sixth seal was opened, with a big earthquake and the sun being black and the moon being light blood and the stars falling to the earth and so on, and all this worship that comes later when you finally see what the end is going to be like, and all the happiness and the joy. But man, as I close this for today, notice what happens when we turn the page to chapter 8 and we read the Lamb opening the seventh seal on the scroll. Where in verse 1, chapter 8, it says, when the Lamb opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about a half an hour. Think about that. Just moments ago, the heavenly throne room was filled with innumerable amount of people from all nations and all tongues, surrounded by creatures and angelic hosts and all the heavenlies, worshiping, praising God, crying in a loud voice. That was a huge celebratory moment when God's victory, his final victory, is being foreshadowed with imagining every tear being wiped from everyone's eye. It's a foreshadowing of pretty much the greatest reality that humankind could ever know. And now when the seventh seal is opened, it is utterly silent in heaven. And that for a good length of time. The praising comes to an end. The rejoicing comes to an end. Worship and adoration comes to an end. Celebration comes to an end. And if you can't read the writing on the wall, folks, the party is over, guys. And why is this? Why does everything come to a complete silence? Because the reality of what is still now concerning Satan's evil is about to be further revealed. And now the seventh seal has been cracked. Man, the reality that the Lamb is about to reveal after the opening of the seventh seal is grim. It's going to be horrific. It puts heaven to silence because it's all the work of the kingdom of darkness. We're going to start there next time, folks. So thanks for joining me today, and be blessed.